All right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. Most of you might know Harold. If not, some of us remember him from when he used to work here. So welcome back, Harold, and tell us about your latest book. Why did you write it? And let's hear about your background.
Okay. I wrote this book because people who read the book I wrote before this book asked for it. So I, to make a long story short, started writing about the science of cooking back in the late 70s. And happily, certainly for me, but I think for all of us, the world has gotten more interested in the science of cooking and in cooking in general, and it's gotten a lot better over the last few decades. So this book that I wrote the first time in late 70s and then redid for 2004 is a book that's essentially about the nature of the ingredients that we use and the way that the techniques we use to cook them change them. So lots of chemistry, biology, some physics, and so on. And I try to cover all the bases and explain a lot, which means that there's only so much depth I can get into and particularity. Professional and home cooks both would tell me, love that big fat red book of yours, but when I'm in the kitchen cooking something and I have a problem and I try to find a solution in your book, it takes me too long. I can't find it. And so I decided to write a book that would not have any just kind of interesting by the way sort of information. It would be very specific and intended to be used in the kitchen to solve particular problems quickly, and then to be closed and put away, and the cook gets back to cooking.
And can you just give us a little background on yourself?
Yeah, I started out at Caltech as an undergraduate, majoring in astronomy. And in a way, I haven't gone that far, right? I've just added a G. I changed my mind in my junior year for a variety of reasons, and ended up graduating from Caltech with a Bachelor of Science degree in literature, which it turns out you can do. The great thing about that education was that once I was no longer an astronomy major, I could cherry pick the science courses. You know, I was doing my literature fine, but then I could, there were all these amazing courses being given, and I could just pick whichever ones I wanted to take, and if I could talk the professor into being in the course, I could do it. So it was a great general education in science. And I then went on to graduate school, got a PhD in literature, and then I couldn't get a job. So I decided to try to recoup my investment in science. I'd also been teaching writing, so I thought I would practice what I'd been teaching and write about science. And I chose the science of everyday life as something that wasn't being much written about, and picked cooking mainly because I like to eat, I like to cook. My friends like to eat and cook, and they kind of encouraged me in this. And so I ended up writing about a subject that had been overlooked, and I found a niche. I was very lucky in that sense, and I've been writing about it ever since.
So I had the pleasure of eating with Harold today, and I also learned that you helped come up with the term molecular gastronomy. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I'm ashamed. I think it's a horrible term. It doesn't really mean anything, and it sounds as though it means a lot more than it does. It was essentially a little bit of marketing, because back in the late 70s, early 80s, the handful of us who were interested in the science of cooking at the time wanted to put together a conference in which basic scientists and professional cooks could get together and talk to each other, and that was not happening much back then. So we found a venue for it, the Scientific Conference Center. The director was willing to do this because he knew a couple of the people involved, a couple of the scientists. But he said the science of cooking as the subject for this workshop, you know, put up against cosmology and molecular biology and all the things they normally handled just didn't look right. So he said we had to come up with a better name for the workshop than the science of cooking. And so we kind of went overboard. Molecular biology was a big thing, big new thing back then, and so we just used that as our model and went from molecular biology to molecular gastronomy, never thinking that it was going to come to cover the multitude of sins that it covers today. I prefer to call what people are doing today sort of in avant-garde cooking, experimental cooking, because I think that really is what it's about. It's trying things that haven't been tried before.
So can you just talk about your fondest food memory and what your food background is? I know that you had, your parents were really passionate about cooking, so has that like influenced you later in life, and is that why you're here today?
I don't think so. I was, grew up in the Midwest. My father had been born in Ohio. My mother was born and raised in India, so that was a little different, and we had Indian food every once in a while, which my friends could smell a mile away, and it made them run away. I loved it. And my father enjoyed cooking roasts on the weekends, but it really wasn't that unusual an upbringing. I think my first serious effort in the kitchen took place when my parents were away, and I noticed that there was a pound of bacon in the refrigerator, and so I put that pound of bacon in a toaster oven.
And what happened? And
it was delicious. Really, really smoky, but delicious.
So where do you think we are with food today, and where do you think we're going to go?
I have no clue. I would never have guessed when I started writing about food that we would be here, or that we would have been 10 years ago where we were 10 years ago. But it seems to me that the great thing about the food world now is that people all over the world understand how wonderful a part of our life it is and how much there is to explore that we haven't explored before. So when I grew up, there were restaurants of particular national varieties, and you really didn't have a whole lot of choice. And even those national varieties were, in the Midwest in the 1950s and 60s, caricatures of the original. So I think the combination of travel, first of all, the passing of the world wars, and rationing, and the growth of income so that people could afford to pay more for food, and then travel and information technologies, shipping technologies, everything has conspired to make the world just completely an open book now. I mean, you get interested in a particular ingredient, and you can go on the web and find people who have been, geeking out on it incredibly, and you can find out amazing stuff in minutes. When I started writing about the science of cooking, you have to understand this was, I did it on an electric typewriter. I wrote a 1,000-page book on an electric typewriter, and to do the research, I went to a library, and I looked at the index volumes of journals, and if I couldn't find in, say, 10 index volumes a paper on the subject that I was interested in, I had to give up because I didn't have the time to keep looking. And nowadays, the problem is, if anything, is too much information, not being able to find information. So I think it's a golden age for people who are interested in food.
And so how did you learn how to cook? Because I thought this was an interesting story.
I learned to cook by writing the book. I decided to write about the science of food and cooking, as I said, because I enjoyed food and cooking, and my friends did as well. But I was 25, 26 years old. I hadn't done a whole lot of it, and I'd been spending most of my time in libraries and teaching, not a lot of time cooking. So I kind of learned on the job. I bought a bunch of books, and back then, Julia Child was about the only one on TV. Maybe The Galloping Gourmet, Graham Kerr was on as well, but not a whole lot to work with. But I worked with what was there and just spent a lot of time in the kitchen. And actually, that was a big part of the appeal for me, and why I kept with it, is that the subject, the science of cooking, is on the one hand kind of abstruse and can be theoretical. But in the end, you go into the kitchen and you cook something and you eat it. And so that combination of the intellectual side and the kind of craftsman side and the pure pleasure is, I think it's a unique combination.
So you're from the Bay Area, and what are some of your favorite restaurants in the Bay Area? And why?
Okay. Well, I'm not a restaurant reviewer. So when I go to restaurants, I'm not looking at the experience from that perspective. I'm just kind of enjoying what I'm getting. And some places I go back because it's so good. And I would say my favorites run the range from a place called Koi, C-O-I. It's on Broadway in the city, a small place. The chef's name is Daniel Patterson, and he does sort of local, sustainable stuff, but with a twist. It's always really interesting. He's very inventive. And there's a lot more technique behind the dishes than you're aware of when you're actually eating them. There's a great experimental in its own way Italian restaurant called Incanto, also in the city, where the fun comes not from the technique, but from the fact that the chef there is just one of the most restless people I know, and is always looking for dishes in the Italian tradition that he's never cooked before or never experienced before. So I had a book party at Incanto for On Food and Cooking, and he did a menu for it, and one of the dishes was a stew, the recipe for which he found in manuscripts that were associated with the building of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, and it was the stew that was given to the people who laid tile in St. Mark's Cathedral, which is a way of connecting with not just food, but history and a national tradition in a way that's really unusual. So those are a couple places. There's a great place, Mission Chinese, which is it's a restaurant within a restaurant. It's on Mission. It's a standard Chinese-American restaurant with a plastic book of the usual dishes. But there's a second menu, which is being cooked by two guys working out of the same kitchen. And it's their take on kind of Chinese, modernized Chinese cooking. And it's amazing. And the prices are not that different. So it's a great cheap place to go.
Any recommendations for down here?
Well, I haven't lived down here for a few years, so I'm not up on who's still open and who's not. But I did recently, at long last, get to Beaumais on California Avenue, which is sometimes tagged as a molecular gastronomy restaurant. I would say it's experimental cooking, and in my experience, I think it's great that people are doing this kind of thing these days. I would say that the number of good meals I've had in restaurants of that sort is pretty small, but this was one of them. I was really happily surprised. I didn't think that on California Avenue I'd have a great experimental meal, but it was fantastic.
Okay, so I'd like to open up to any questions, because I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions for Harold, so any questions? Anyone outline, I'll be happy to come by with the mic. No questions from Googlers, really?
Hi there, my name is Chris, and thanks for taking time to come visit us. So, wondering if you can give us some insight into how you wrote the book. Did you say to yourself, okay, people are asking me for tips on all this stuff, so did you just start listing categories like you have on the front page and then just rip through all the different types of meats? And did you say to yourself, I'm going to take, sledgehammers and lighters and kind of destroy or play around with food? Like, did you have a framework, or did you just kind of say, I'm having spinach tonight and I'm going to try, something interesting?
A bit of both, and a couple of other things. So the original idea was to write a book that would live in the kitchen and give information that either recipe books don't give you or give you, but it's usually wrong. So that meant, first of all, thinking about the range of things that people generally cook. That there aren't a lot of unusual dishes, because it's meant to be for the kind of cooking that most people do most of the time. And then it was a matter of, the other thing I kept in my mind was, I have 2 kids who are in their early 20s. And what I wanted to do was write a kind of book that would be kind of like, an unobnoxious version of me. Somebody kind of standing back in the kitchen, and if you want to ask me a question to help out, I'm there, but I'm not pushing it on you. Just as a resource. So if you're doing fine with a recipe, then you don't have to bother opening up the book. But I wanted there to be information there so that if something is going wrong, or if you ask yourself, for example, the kind of question I ask myself all the time. I'm cooking pasta for the millionth time, and I'm pouring gallons of water, hot water, down the drain and steaming up my glasses so I can't see for 5 seconds. And all of a sudden it occurs to me, do I really have to be doing this? Do I need gallons of water to keep the pasta from sticking, or can I just use as much water as it takes? Then I do the experiment and come up with an answer. So I'm trying to provide that kind of information, alternative ways of doing things that recipe books often don't tell you about, but that work just as well, sometimes better.
Great. 2 follow-up questions. So you mentioned you hate it when cookbooks like tell you the wrong thing. What's kind of one of your pet peeves of I don't know, the general population says you should do X when you say we should do Y?
Okay. The thing that I've been ranting about since 1984, which shows you what kind of influence I have, is this idea that searing meat seals in the juices. Cooking meat at really high temperatures to begin with kind of cauterizes the outside so that the juices can't come out. It's just not true. The juiciness of a piece of meat depends on the temperature to which the inside of the meat has been cooked, period. Doesn't matter what the external temperatures have been. And you hear professional chefs on television, people who should know better, who've been to school, and my book is used as a textbook at the CIA and places like that. They say it, I think, because it just sounds so good. You got to fill up the airtime, and I'm searing this piece of meat because it seals in the juices. Anyway, that's number 1, and it'll probably be number 1 on my list the day I die.
Great, and then a last question. What's been like your biggest aha moment in the kitchen, whether it's something in your book or not?
Well, there have been so many times when I've been surprised, when I thought I knew what was going on and it turned out I didn't. And again, maybe I'll just give you sort of a prototypical one, which goes back a ways. I was thinking when I started to write this book back in the late 70s, there's this body of information called food science developed for the food industries, and I was essentially translating that into English for home cooks. And I thought that, chemists knew what they needed to know, and that I knew, because I knew some chemistry, I knew what I needed to know. And so I saw in Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking, the claim that when you're making a meringue or a souffle, so you're whipping up egg whites to make a foam, you should use a copper bowl, because copper acidifies the egg whites and makes the foam more stable. And I looked in the egg chemistry literature, and there was nothing about that. And I knew from basic chemistry that copper is not going to change the pH of a solution. So I just thought, old cook's tale, forget about it. Didn't follow up on it. So fast forward a couple of years, and I'm looking for out of copyright illustrations to use in my book so that I wouldn't have to pay for them. And so I'm looking in old books, and I come across this French encyclopedia from the 18th century. It's a pastry kitchen, and it has an illustration with a key. And the key says that there's a little boy in the corner of the pastry kitchen whipping egg whites in a copper bowl to make biscuits. So I thought, maybe if Julia Child is saying something that they've been doing for a couple hundred years, it's worth a look. And so I did what I should have done the very first time and whipped egg whites in a glass bowl and a copper bowl side by side so that I could really compare them. Completely different. And the copper bowl made a much more stable foam. And a year or two later, I published a paper in Nature on the subject. So that was an aha moment in the sense that things that you think you know and that are just kind of everyday observations and experiences can have all kinds of depth to them, and so I never take anything for granted anymore.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
I wanted to say my wife got me your book like 10 years ago, and it was just a revelation. It was amazing to see someone looking at scientifically, and especially the example you just brought up where you actually would weigh the meat. And it seems so obvious in hindsight. I don't understand why no one else did it, but apparently you're the first person to think of that.
No, actually, that's part of the funny story. The guy who came up with the idea that searing seals in the juices was a chemist, not a cook. That's another aha. Chemists can be wrong, are often wrong. So it was a chemist's idea, and it was disproved by home economists at the USDA in the 1930s. So they did the experiments way back, and people just forgot about them.
Wow.
So.
Anyway, my question is, earlier you mentioned you were sort of surprised in the way things had gone in terms of food in this country, I guess. Could you describe some of the ways things have gone that you didn't expect?
Well, I would say this experimental movement, the kind of thing that that brings liquid nitrogen into the kitchen, and industrial ingredients that 10 years ago, if a chef heard that there was carrageenan in anything, he would say, that's not food. I don't know what it is, but it's not food. Now chefs are using carrageenan because it turns out you can do really interesting things with these hydrocolloids from seaweeds. So I didn't see that coming. The really rapid adoption of not just understanding and information, but the materials and the machines that had been used for very different purposes in other parts of the culture. So that's been a lot of fun to watch.
I'm also a big fan, and I have one story and then a question. And the story is to anybody that I'm friends with who's at least a little bit analytical in their cooking. I give your on food and cooking too. But my dad is sort of the worst cook in a lot of ways, but he's a pretty decent cook, but he only reads recipes, and if he's missing an ingredient, he gets in the car, drives to the store, and goes and buys that one ingredient, and he'll do it 2 or 3 times in one recipe. And in my work, I offset Google's carbon footprint. I'm constantly concerned about carbon footprints, and I hate watching him do it. But I gave him your book, and I showed him you can just look up the ingredient you're missing and find a suitable replacement. And so I love that he could sort of use that book to sort of reduce his carbon footprint. So I just wanted to thank you for that. But my question is, I have your second book, and I've been working my way through it since Christmas, and I've noticed that it's very heavily focused on food safety. You spend a lot of time on food safety, and to be frank, that's kind of a bore. And I'm wondering what was the reason for including so much information about that? Do you see the need? Did the publisher make you? Is it one of your crusades? I'm just sort of curious.
Yeah, it is a very good question. It's there because I've come to think that it's important. And I agree with you that it's a bore. It's certainly not the thing that I want to think about when I'm in the kitchen. But I think that's part of the reason that it's a problem, is that we don't think enough about it. And you can get by in life and be lucky and not have a problem by doing things without really thinking about what's growing on things in front of your eyes. But I've been cooking now and eating other people's food for decades, and I've noticed some patterns. And I have friends, for example, who always, when I go to their house, make the food like 6 or 8 hours ahead, or maybe the night before, and they just leave it on the countertop. And every time I eat at their place, I suffer for it the next day. And I have a feeling I'm not the only one with that kind of experience. I mean, and my friends, by the way, are scientists. They're microbiologists. They know how things grow. They just don't connect the dots. And so what I wanted to do, there's not a long chapter, all the chapters are short. There's a chapter devoted to food safety, and then there's maybe a page in each chapter on other subjects devoted to food safety for that particular ingredient or that particular food. So I don't think it's out of proportion. And especially these days, I describe this in the book. I have an elderly father who loves essentially raw hamburgers. And he has gotten really sick ordering really raw hamburgers at restaurants, and at his age he can't afford that. And so I came up with a way of giving him a really raw burger but making it safe. And so I think just you know, it's a book. You don't have to look at those pages if you don't want to, but they're there if you do.
Back to the searing food issue. About 4 years ago, I asserted to you that I had read on food and cooking, and I quoted that, and you said, no, actually, that's from The Curious Cook. And I said, oops. But I wonder if you knew that Alton Brown had ripped you off and done a show where he used that exact same example with the same way of proving it, and didn't credit either you or the USDA or anybody else.
Well, that's you know, there are ups and downs to subjects becoming popular, in part through your work. And I would say, on balance, Alton Brown is great. He may not have done it on that program, but on some programs he actually opens the show. You know, the camera pans in, and he's lying in a hammock reading my book. So you know, he doesn't hide it, and I think he's a great educator in a way that I'm not. I mean, I've written a couple of books. And I think I've had an influence on professionals more than on the average person who's interested in food. He's really reached millions of people I would never reach. And you know, sometimes he cuts corners, sometimes it's not quite right. But on balance, I think he does a great public service. So.
Aside from your books, what else do you recommend reading about cooking or food?
Well, I would say, you know, any book that's been written kind of from the inside of a food culture by someone who knows how to write. I mean, I've got lots and lots of books that I really love, not because they you know, give me any insights into the chemistry of a particular cuisine or anything. It's just that they give me a picture of that cuisine that helps me understand it in a deeper way. So, and that's one of the other great things about being alive now is to have this kind of repository of sort of accumulated experience. And I mean, the books, people make fun of cookbooks these days, but I think it's amazing to have the kind of documentation of the things that are done all around the world. On the more technical side, I would suggest keeping your eyes open over the next couple of months for something that's going to be coming out of Seattle from a guy who used to be at Microsoft and is now not exactly both feet, but sort of a foot and a half in the cooking world, and that's Nathan Myhrvold, who has a book coming out called Modernist Cuisine. It's actually 6 volumes in one. And I've seen PDFs for many of the chapters. I've not actually held the book in my hands yet. It's massive. He tells me that the ink alone in this book weighs 4 pounds, and he was a postdoc with Stephen Hawking, so a physicist originally. So he takes the subject really seriously. It also turns out that he's a wonderful writer, and so it's a wonderful combination of really detailed technical information, some of it completely new because he can afford to do experiments that no one else can, but written in a way that's really approachable and really understandable. Is he going to be coming here? He's
possibly, but I do want to ask you a question on that. 4 pounds of ink in one book. As a publisher and a writer, where do you think that we'll be in 10 years? Will everything be tablet-based?
Well, I don't know. I started out in literature, and so I've got a feeling for books that maybe has more to do with that than anything else. I love books. I also like the tablet version of my book because I can do a word search really quickly, much faster than I can flipping through the book. So I've got both, and I use them for different things. And I think that'll be the case. I think there'll be hard copies for certain aspects of the experience and electronic copies for the others.
So I think molecular gastronomy may not be the greatest misnaming thing these days, since everybody wants to refer to low temperature cooking as sous vide.
Right.
You got the sous vide supreme and the sous vide professional, and it's really hard to call things by the right names when the label right in front of you has the wrong name on it.
That's right.
So I have a question about that. When you cook meats, when you roast meats, or even pan roast things, when you want to make a sauce at the end, the great thing is all the pan drippings and all the liquid that's left over. Mm-hmm. But when you cook things low temperature in a bag, you get this liquid which gets cloudy and coagulates and makes a horrible mess. What's up with that?
Yeah, so it's true that low temperature cooking gets you a lot of desirable things, but it also loses you a few. And certainly the pan drippings is the major one. That's also, in my mind, the reason not to brine meats, turkeys or anything else, because the drippings end up way too salty to turn into a sauce. So when you cook something at low temperature, you're actually minimizing the amount of juice lost from the meat, and what juice that is lost also sits there at a low temperature, which means that it's just warm beef juice. Whereas if you're roasting it, the juices fall onto the pan, the water evaporates, and then the fat and the protein and the carbohydrate react with each other in the pan with the oven heat, and gives you the Maillard reactions, browning reactions, which generate these wonderfully complex, rich, deep flavors. You don't get that with sous vide, but what you can do is open the bag, take those juices out, and then essentially do that as a separate step. So just put the juices into a frying pan and fry them until you get the flavor. It's not quite the same, but an approximation.
So speaking of Nathan Myhrvold, let me say I love to barbecue, but it takes a really long time to get the meat to that soft, moist state. And in an interview recently, he said he was looking at barbecue stall, where it sort of hits 150 and stays there for a really long time. And coming as a chemist, I would have thought it was the heat capacity of the fat, but he thinks it's actually evaporation of moisture on the surface. So can we take something like that and speed up barbecuing so it only takes, say, 4 hours for good ribs?
Great question. And my guess is, and at this point, as the Julia Child example shows, if I haven't actually done the experiment, I'm going to hedge. My guess is the answer is no, because the process of tenderizing those cuts is the process of dissolving the collagen into gelatin. And that happens very quickly near the boil and very slowly at temperatures that maintain the moistness of the meat. And so I don't see a way of decoupling those two processes. Maybe someone will come up with something, but at the moment I don't see it.
So I have a question about your work as a writer and how you set yourself up to do that. Do you have any places or rituals that you go to or go through to sit down when you sit down to write?
Well, let's see. These days, I mean, I moved from Palo Alto to the city 4 or 5 years ago, and one of the things I like about the place I moved is that I have several different windows that I can go sit in with my laptop and work on whatever I'm working on. If I have to have lots of papers spread out, then by definition it's my desk, but otherwise I like to travel. I would say that's about the only, I don't give it a whole lot of thought. It's more the pressure that I'm feeling. You know, if I'm past deadline or on deadline, especially I write for the New York Times, and when I'm doing something for them, then sometimes I'll just stay away from the window because I know that's asking for distraction.
Are there any kitchen tools or utensils or dishes that almost nobody has and you think more people should?
I don't know about I mean, these days everybody has everything, as far as I can tell. My favorite tools are a thermocouple digital thermometer, not a thermistor, but a thermocouple, because the thermistors are larger, and so you can't get the probe down to a nice small size to get a truly instantaneous reading. With a thermocouple probe, you can get a hypodermic needle tip, and you really do, you get an instant reading. I mean, going in and going out of the hole, you see the temperature changing. It's a great way to kind of get an idea of what's going on inside whatever it is you're cooking. And I also love the infrared non-contact thermometer, just for a really quick way of telling, you know, what the inside of your oven is looking like at a given moment, and what your food is looking like, because you just point it and it takes a reading of the black body radiation coming from the surface of the food and turns that into a temperature. And it's true that you have to be careful with certain kinds of food. If you have evaporation going on, for example, you're going to get a falsely low reading, but it's a great tool for all kinds of things. And then the third thing that I love, which was alluded to before, often talked about in the context of sous vide, but it's actually low temperature cooking, temperature control, an immersion circulator, which is a way of essentially making a lab water bath in your kitchen. So you can control the temperature down to a degree or so and really get an amazing range of textures that you would never dream existed otherwise, because you just wouldn't be able to realize them. So those three things. Yeah.
Just wanted to suggest one more use for one of those three and a fourth that we have in our kitchen. I use the infrared thermometer. So I figured out for each beer sort of what temperature it tastes best at. So I take it out of the fridge, leave it on the counter, and shoot it, and I say, you know, we're at 45 degrees or 50 degrees or whatever, that's right for that beer. Pour it out, yum. And then the other thing is, basically any high-quality pH meter is a great thing to have in the kitchen, because my wife loves to can, but the tomatoes from our garden vary all over the map in terms of acidity. And it used to be that the canned tomatoes were too acid, because she's always scared of germs, so she would pour in all this vinegar. So I basically got her a pH meter, so she would put in basically the right much.
Great ideas.
Guys, we have time for maybe one or two more questions, because I'm sure you want to get your book signed. So any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And do you mind signing some books?